His rise was meteoric and his fall relentless. From a young Corsican officer to an emperor who ruled almost all of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte left a legacy that still shapes history today. This is the story of a genius, a conqueror, and a visionary, whose triumphs and defeats changed the face of the world. Welcome to the documentary film about Napoleon.
Paris, October 1795. The streets are tense. Royalist protesters march on the National Convention, threatening to overthrow the revolutionary government. Chaos looms. A young artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, is given temporary command of the defense. Without hesitation, he moves cannons into position, right through the crowds, with the help of Joachim Murat, a young cavalry officer. When the crowd refuses to disperse, he gives the order to fire. In a single day, the rebellion is crushed. Napoleon becomes a household name. The Directory, the government of post-revolutionary France, suddenly sees him not just as a loyal officer, but as a weapon of survival. Within months, he's promoted and chosen to lead one of France's most important campaigns, a military offensive against Austria in northern Italy. It's March 1796. He is just 26 years old. The army of Italy he inherits is underfed, unpaid, and on the verge of collapse. But Napoleon acts quickly. He boosts morale, reorganizes his officers, and begins an aggressive and fast-moving campaign. At Lodi, he defeats Austrian forces and earns the respect of his soldiers, many of whom begin calling him the Little Corporal, a nickname that reflects his closeness with the men in the ranks. He shares their food, marches beside them, and knows many of them by name. Over the following months, he drives Austrian forces out of Lombardy and forces the Papal States into submission. When Pope Pius VI protests the execution of Louis XVI, France retaliates by annexing papal territories. Though Napoleon is ordered to march on Rome, he refuses, showing, for the first time, his willingness to disobey civilian leadership when he disagrees. A year later, Rome is invaded by another French general, and the Pope dies in captivity. Meanwhile, Napoleon continues his advance into Austria. His victories pile up. By 1797, Austria sues for peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio gives France control over Belgium, northern Italy, the Rhineland, and parts of the Netherlands. A secret clause hands the remains of the Venetian Republic, once a 1,000-year-old independent power, over to Austria. In exchange, Venice is effectively erased from the map. Across Italy, Napoleon establishes new sister republics modeled after France, including the Cisalpine Republic. These are not independent states, but satellites of Paris, bound to French interests. At the same time, Napoleon is becoming more than a general, he is becoming a political force. He begins publishing newspapers for his army, full of patriotic propaganda, and distributes them in France as well. He carefully cultivates his public image. In May 1797, he launches a third paper, this time in Paris. Royalists are gaining strength in national elections, and Napoleon is becoming a symbol of revolutionary strength. When the Royalist bloc threatens the Directory, Napoleon intervenes from afar. He sends General Pierre Augereau to carry out a bloodless coup on September 4. The Royalists are removed from government. The Directory survives, but now, its stability depends on Napoleon. At this point, he is the most powerful man in France, without holding any political office. His military success, his popularity with the public, and his control of the narrative make him untouchable. But Napoleon is ambitious. In 1798, he proposes a bold new plan, a military expedition to Egypt. Officially, it's to protect French trade and challenge British access to India. In reality, it's a way to expand French influence in the East, and perhaps eventually march toward India itself. The Directory, nervous about his popularity, agrees. Sending him far from Paris seems like a good idea. In May 1798, Napoleon departs France with a fleet and over 30,000 men, along with more than 160 scientists, engineers, artists, and historians. It's a campaign unlike anything seen before. On June 9, he captures Malta from the Knights of St. John. Then, after narrowly avoiding the British Navy, he lands in Alexandria on July 1. Soon after, Napoleon marches inland to face the Mamluks, the dominant military force in Egypt. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he confronts a massive army, nearly 100,000 Mamluks against 25,000 French troops. But Napoleon uses new tactics. His troops form hollow squares with artillery and supply wagons in the center, protecting against cavalry charges. The Mamluks are crushed. In a few hours, Napoleon controls Cairo. But the campaign quickly takes a dark turn. On August 1st, British Admiral Horatio Nelson finds the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay, and destroys it. Of the entire French fleet, only 2 ships escape. Napoleon's army is now trapped in Egypt, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Still, he tries to consolidate power. He positions himself as a liberator of the Egyptian people, portraying the French as allies against the Ottoman Empire. But the population remains skeptical. Revolts break out, and resistance grows. In early 1799, Napoleon begins a new campaign into Ottoman Syria, present-day Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon. He leads 13,000 men north, capturing towns like Al-Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. But the campaign becomes notorious for its brutality. At Jaffa, Napoleon's army kills 1,400 Ottoman soldiers who tried to surrender. Over the next 3 days, French troops loot the city and kill civilians. Napoleon later orders the execution of 3,000 Turkish prisoners. His army is suffering. Disease spreads, especially plague. Supplies are scarce. And when they reach Acre, they face strong resistance. The French cannot take the city. Weakened and demoralized, the army retreats back to Egypt. Napoleon orders the abandonment, and in some cases, execution, of wounded soldiers and plague victims, fearing they will slow down the withdrawal. Back in Egypt, he wins one last major engagement, the Second Battle of Aboukir, on July 25, defeating a Turkish force trying to land on the coast. But by now, it's clear, the Egyptian expedition has failed strategically. His army is stranded, supplies are running low, and France is at war again in Europe. In August 1799, Napoleon secretly leaves Egypt, boarding a ship and sailing back to France without informing the Directory. He leaves his army behind under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Kleber. Though the campaign in Egypt ends in military failure, Napoleon returns home to a hero's welcome. The French public is unaware of the full extent of the disaster. His control of the press, his reputation, and his timing ensure that only his victories are remembered. The Directory is weak. France is unstable. People are desperate for a strong leader. From Corsican outsider to the master of Europe's largest republic, Napoleon's rise was fast, ruthless, and calculated. His military victories and political instincts turned him into a symbol of revolutionary France, and a threat to the old monarchies of Europe. In 1804, he would crown himself emperor. But that's a story for the next chapter.
Emerging from the sands of Egypt, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France ready to change Europe forever. His rise led to an epic naval clash that would decide the fate of empires, the Battle of Trafalgar. This battle was a test of strategy, courage, and sacrifice on the high seas, shaping history in ways no one could have predicted. While Napoleon was in Egypt, he closely followed the developments in Europe through newspapers and dispatches that arrived irregularly. On August 23, 1799, he suddenly decided to return to France to take advantage of the temporary absence of British ships that were blockading French ports. Although there were accusations that Napoleon abandoned his army, in fact, the Directory ordered him to return because France had suffered several defeats against the forces of the Second Coalition and feared an invasion. By the time Napoleon returned to Paris in October 1799, the military situation had improved significantly due to several French victories. However, the French Republic was on the brink of bankruptcy, and the corrupt and inefficient Directory had never been less popular. Emmanuel Sieyès, one of the members of the Directory, approached Napoleon seeking support for a coup d'état and the abolition of the Constitution. The conspiracy involved Napoleon Bonaparte, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, Napoleon's brother Lucien Bonaparte, who was the spokesman of the Council of 500, Roger Ducos, a member of the Directory, and Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire, Napoleon carried out the coup. It took them 2 days to establish control and remove the legislative bodies. This allowed the reduced legislative body to appoint Napoleon, Sieyès, and Ducos as provisional consuls to govern the country. Sieyès had intended to use Napoleon to seize power for himself, but Napoleon outmaneuvered him and secured the adoption of the Constitution of the year 8, which ensured his election as first consul, making him the most powerful person in France. He further solidified his power with the Constitution of the year 10, becoming first consul for life. As first consul, Napoleon implemented several lasting reforms: centralized administration of departments, improvements in higher education, tax reforms, creation of a central bank, new legal codes, and upgrades to road and sewage systems. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with the Catholic Church to reconcile the Catholic population with his regime. On March 21, 1804, the Civil Code, known as the Napoleonic Code, was promulgated. This code, prepared by legal committees supervised by Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès, the second consul, remains influential in many countries today. Napoleon actively participated in council meetings where draft laws were discussed. Additional codes were introduced, including one in 1808 for criminal procedure, establishing clear rules of trial that, by modern standards, favored the prosecution but helped curb abuses and protect personal freedoms. In 1800, Napoleon returned to Italy, where the Austrians and Russians under Suvorov had gained ground during his absence. Napoleon famously crossed the Alps riding a mule, the white horse depicted in popular paintings by Jacques-Louis David. His campaign started but turned in June 1800 with the victory at the Battle of Marengo, which led to a truce. His brother, Joseph Bonaparte, led the peace negotiations. Despite some Austrian resistance backed by Britain and their refusal to recognize the newly acquired French territories, Napoleon ordered General Jean Moreau to launch another attack. Moreau's victory at the Battle of Hohenlinden resulted in the Treaty of Luneville in February 1801, confirming or expanding French territorial gains. Great Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802, agreeing to withdraw from several colonies. However, this peace was short-lived. European monarchies refused to recognize the French Republic fully, fearing revolutionary ideas might spread. Britain officially recognized France as a republic, but still supported royalist forces. They also protested French annexations in Piedmont and Napoleon's mediation in Switzerland, which were not covered by the treaty. In 1803, Napoleon suffered a severe defeat in Haiti. His forces, sent to reassert control, were decimated by yellow fever and insurgents led by Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Facing the impossibility of holding French territories in North America and anticipating renewed war with Britain, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States at a low price, $7.40 per square kilometer. Tensions over Malta continued, with Britain resuming war against France in 1803 and supporting French royalists. In January 1804, a failed assassination attempt on Napoleon was uncovered, sponsored by the Bourbons. In retaliation, Napoleon's police arrested the Duke of Mangan, who was tried secretly and executed in March 1804, despite no evidence linking him to the plot. This incident helped Napoleon justify restoring hereditary monarchy in France, with himself as emperor. Napoleon crowned himself emperor on December 2, 1804, at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, famously taking the crown from the Pope and placing it on his own head. Later, on May 26, 1805, he was crowned King of Italy in Milan Cathedral. The Battle of Trafalgar was the most significant naval battle of the Napoleonic Wars. It took place on October 21, 1805, between the British Royal Navy and the combined fleets of France and Spain off Cape Trafalgar on the southwest coast of Spain, between Gibraltar and Cadiz. At the time, France was the dominant military power on the European continent, while Britain controlled the seas. Britain had established a naval blockade against France, severely limiting French trade and naval operations. Although the French fleet managed to evade the blockade several times, they were never able to deliver a decisive defeat to the British Navy. Britain was able to attack French interests worldwide with ease. When the Third Coalition declared war on France, Napoleon planned to invade Britain. To succeed, he had to ensure that the British Navy could not stop the invasion fleet, which meant controlling the English Channel. The main French fleets were based at Brest in Brittany and Toulon on the Mediterranean coast. Smaller squadrons were scattered across other Atlantic ports. Spain, allied with France, contributed its fleet from Cadiz and Ferrol. Britain had experienced and well-trained naval officers, while most of France's best officers had been killed or dismissed during the Revolution. Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve was the most competent French officer commanding Napoleon's Mediterranean fleet. Napoleon's 1805 strategy was for the French and Spanish fleets to break through the British blockade, unite in the Caribbean, and then return to Europe to assist the Brest fleet in breaking the blockade of the Channel. This combined fleet would then control the Channel, allowing the invasion of Britain. Admiral Nelson commanded the blockade of Toulon early in 1805, maintaining a loose blockade hoping to lure the French fleet into a decisive battle. Villeneuve's fleet successfully evaded Nelson after a storm and sailed through Gibraltar to join the Spanish fleet, heading for the West Indies. Upon realizing this, Nelson pursued. Villeneuve returned from the West Indies intending to break the blockade at Brest. After suffering setbacks including losing ships off Cape Finisterre, he sailed to Ferrol. Napoleon's plans for invading England depended on the fleet assembling at Boulogne-sur-Mer. Villeneuve had 32 ships, with Vice Admiral Ganteaume's Brest fleet having 21 ships and 5 others, aiming to muster 58 ships for the invasion. Villeneuve was ordered to sail north towards Brest but deviated to Cadiz. The invasion army waited for the fleet, and when Villeneuve did not appear by August 26, 3 French invasion corps moved towards Germany, becoming fully engaged there. Nelson returned home after 2 years at sea, staying 25 days in England. News arrived on September 2nd that the combined French-Spanish fleet was in Cadiz. Nelson waited until September 15th when his flagship HMS Victory was ready. Vice Admiral Collingwood led 20 ships detached to face the enemy fleet in Cadiz, leaving only 11 ships to guard the channel. Nelson took command on September 29th. The British fleet used frigates to monitor the Cadiz harbor while the main fleet remained about 80 kilometers west of the coast. Nelson hoped to lure the enemy fleet out. The British fleet suffered supply issues, sending 5 ships to Gibraltar on October 2nd for provisions. The French fleet in Cadiz also faced supply shortages and a lack of experienced sailors. Many crew members had been blockaded in port for years with minimal sea time. Villeneuve hesitated to leave Cadiz despite improved supplies in October. French captains voted to remain in port. Napoleon ordered the fleet to sail at the first opportunity to meet Spanish reinforcements and land the invasion force at Naples, promising a determined fight if they encountered British ships. During the blockade, Nelson gave his captains instructions on combat tactics, emphasizing breaking the enemy line and concentrating superior force on one section. His plan was unconventional, abandoning the usual parallel lines in favor of dividing the fleet into 2 columns to penetrate the enemy formation. Villeneuve received orders of his replacement and news of British ships arriving at Gibraltar. He decided to engage before his successor's arrival. The French fleet left Cadiz on October 20th in a disorganized formation. Villeneuve attempted to organize 4 squadrons combining French and Spanish ships, but faced resistance from captains unwilling to leave port. By October 21, Nelson's fleet was 34 kilometers northwest of Cape Trafalgar, facing Villeneuve's fleet positioned between them and the Cape. Nelson ordered preparations for battle at 6 a.m. Villeneuve turned his fleet toward Cadiz at 8 a.m., a maneuver complicated by the wind and inexperienced crews, causing a disordered line. At 11:45, Nelson sent his famous signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty." His fleet approached in 2 columns. Nelson led the windward column aboard HMS Victory. Collingwood led the other, on Royal Sovereign. The British ships moved slowly due to light winds, exposing leading vessels to heavy enemy fire for nearly an hour. HMS Royal Sovereign was the first to engage Admiral Alava's flagship, Santa Ana, delivering a devastating broadside. HMS Belle Isle engaged multiple French ships, suffering severe damage but holding on until relief arrived. HMS Victory endured 40 minutes under fire from 4 enemy ships. At 12:45, Victory broke through between Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure and Redoutable, firing devastating broadsides and killing many gun crews. Villeneuve prepared to board Victory, but was thwarted by British resistance and timely support from HMS Temeraire, which inflicted heavy damage on Redoutable. A cannonball from Redoutable mortally wounded Nelson, who declared, "I am done for. I am dead," before dying at 4:30 p.m. Victory ceased firing to repel boarding attempts, but eventually British forces isolated and captured 22 enemy ships with no losses. Nelson's death and British victory secured maritime supremacy for Britain, ending Napoleon's hopes of invading England. Damaged ships sank or were blown ashore during subsequent storms, marking the end of a decisive chapter in naval warfare. The year is 1805. Europe is ablaze, and Napoleon's thirst for domination shows no signs of slowing. While the smoke from the Battle of Trafalgar has yet to clear, and Great Britain celebrates its naval victory, on land, Emperor Napoleon is already crafting plans that will forever change the face of the continent. After his ambitions to invade England were dashed, Napoleon realized that the focus must shift to the continent. Meanwhile, diplomatic maneuvers culminated in the formation of the Third Coalition against France, uniting Great Britain, the Austrian Empire, Sweden, and Russia, powers determined to halt Napoleon's growing might. Napoleon had to act swiftly. His grand invasion plans, which had gathered an incredible grand army of 177,000 soldiers at Boulogne, were abruptly redirected. This unprecedented move transformed an invasion force into an expeditionary army, prepared to march thousands of kilometers across Europe. This lightning march, often called the Race of the Eagles, had one clear objective: to intercept the Austrian forces before they could join with their Russian allies. At the time, the Austrians, with 72,000 troops under the reckless General Karl Marx von Liebknecht, preemptively invaded Bavaria, which had sided with Napoleon. Their strategy wrongly assumed the main battles would take place in northern Italy, not in the heart of Germany. This critical misjudgment shaped what was to follow. Meanwhile, the Russian army under General Mikhail Kutuzov advanced slowly through Poland. Their delay, partly due to logistics and partly due to a misunderstood difference in calendars, often cited as Gregorian versus Julian, the modern historians dismiss this as a myth, gave Napoleon a crucial advantage. In autumn 1805, Napoleon executed one of the most brilliant and decisive maneuvers in military history, culminating in the Battle of Ulm from October 16th to 19th. The Austrian army under General Mack, numerically strong but strategically vulnerable, was pushed deep into Bavaria. Napoleon exploited the Russian delay with masterful precision. His grand army, demonstrating incredible speed and coordination, advanced swiftly into the heart of Germany. After crossing the Rhine, French corps performed a massive right wheel, simultaneously reaching the Danube and turning south, cutting off Mack's supply lines and retreat routes. On October 7th, General Mack finally realized Napoleon's cunning plan. The emperor intended to bypass his right flank and cut off the entire Austrian army from the slowly approaching Russians. Mack tried to regroup, repositioning his left flank at Ulm and right at Rain. Yet the French rolling wave pressed on, crossing the Danube at Neuburg, Donauwörth, and Ingolstadt, placing Napoleon's forces behind the entire Austrian army, effectively encircling it. Austria again faced deadly encirclement. Mack ordered a Danube crossing at Günzburg, but on October 14th, his troops ran into Marshal Ney's Sixth Corps at the Battle of Günzburg. The Austrians suffered heavy losses, around 2,000 men, and were forced back to Ulm. Earlier, on October 11th, Mack's army had attempted a breakout north, but was stopped at the Battle of Haslach-Jungingen, where General Dupont's smaller French division successfully held them back. By October 16th, Napoleon had completed his magical ring. Mack's entire army was surrounded at Ulm. 3 days later, on October 19th, Mack surrendered unconditionally with about 25,000 to 30,000 troops, 18 generals, and 65 artillery pieces. Approximately 20,000 Austrians escaped, while 10,000 were killed or wounded. French losses were minimal, around 500 dead and 1,000 wounded. Upon surrender, Mack reportedly called himself Unfortunate General Mack, to which Napoleon magnanimously returned his sword and freedom. However, back in Austria, Mack was court-martialed and sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. In under 15 days, Napoleon's grand army neutralized an impressive 60,000 Austrian troops, showcasing unmatched speed, precision, and tactical brilliance. While Napoleon celebrated the stunning Ulm victory, remaining Austrian corps and the Russian army hastily retreated towards Vienna, pursued relentlessly by the French. It was a grueling march of exhaustion and desperation. The Russian army, led by General Kutuzov, aware of the danger, also withdrew eastwards, joining remaining Austrian forces under General Michael von Kienmeyer at the Ilz River on October 22nd. Allied forces conducted a successful delaying action at Amstetten on November 5th, slowing French pursuit, but the pressure of Napoleon's grand army was relentless. Russians reached St. Polten on November 7th and crossed the Danube the next day, destroying all bridges behind them and holding the last at Stein until late afternoon. Though victorious at Ulm, Napoleon mistakenly believed Kutuzov would retreat directly to Vienna for a decisive battle. Instead, the cautious Kutuzov continued withdrawing east. Napoleon then created a new 8th Corps under Edouard Mortier to secure the northern Danube bank, prevent reinforcements to the Austrians or Russians, and crucially, block Kutuzov from crossing and fleeing deeper into Russia. Mortier's corps of about 14,000 men crossed the Danube near Linz and Passau in early November and marched east along the river, operating independently. The Battle of Dürnstein, also called the Battle of Lambach, took place on November 11, 1805, in the picturesque Wachau Valley. Mortier's lead division under General Gazin, about 6,000 men, reached Dürnstein. However, Mortier, ignoring Napoleon's strict orders to protect his northern flank, established his headquarters there, feeling secure. Kutuzov devised a complex plan. A column under Streak, around 5,000 men, was to attack the French right wing, while two larger columns under Doktorov and Schmidt, around 13,000 men, aimed to flank the French through the mountains and strike from the rear, trapping them. Mortier wrongly assumed the Russians were retreating and ordered Gazin to attack. Though initially advancing, Gazin's division soon faced much stronger resistance. Around 8 a.m., fighting raged through the villages of Oberleuben and Unterleuben. Doktorov and Schmidt began encircling the French forces. Gazin's division, attempting to break through the narrow Danube gorge, found itself caught between two Russian forces, facing near total destruction. At this critical moment, General Dupont, hearing artillery fire in the distance, rushed to the battle with his division without orders. His surprise flank attack on Doktorov's troops turned the tide. Fighting continued into the night, with Schmidt's forces joining. Under cover of darkness, and with the help of a makeshift flotilla of 50 boats, Mortier evacuated his exhausted troops across the Danube's southern bank, saving his division from annihilation. The Battle of Dürnstein was tactically inconclusive, but strategically important. Suffered about 4,000 casualties, 1,600 dead and wounded, 1,900 captured, and 400 drowned, while the Russians lost around 2,000, 1,000 dead and wounded, 1,000 captured. The battle exposed French vulnerabilities when overextended and confirmed Kutuzov's caution. The Allies continued their retreat, but gained precious time and showed Napoleon that victory would not be easy. The Emperor realized he had to confront the Russo-Austrian forces before they withdrew too far, allowing the war to drag on and the Allies to receive reinforcements. Costing maneuvers and battles at Ulm and Dürnstein where Napoleon showed brilliance but also bitter resistance, a crucial phase of the campaign followed. The French occupied Vienna in November 1805, while the remaining Austrians and most of the Russian army under Kutuzov retreated eastward. Napoleon was eager to end the war, knowing he had to face the combined Allies before Russian and Prussian reinforcements arrived. Prussia was then on the verge of joining the coalition. Napoleon executed a daring move, a masterstroke of tactical deception. He deliberately ordered his troops to withdraw, creating the illusion of weakness and hesitation. Key to this ruse was the intentional abandonment of the strategically vital Pratzen Heights near Austerlitz, present-day Slavkov-Uberna, Czech Republic. Days before the battle, Napoleon spread rumors about troop exhaustion, supply shortages, and even his own doubts. This deception, bolstered by a staged meeting with Prince Peter Dolgorukov, during which Napoleon appeared anxious and hesitant, was flawless. Allied generals, arrogantly confident in French weakness and eager for a quick victory, accepted Austrian Chief of Staff Franz von Weirother's plan. 2nd, 1805, one of history's greatest battles took place, the Battle of Austerlitz. Napoleon's French army faced the combined Russian-Austrian forces led by General Kutuzov, though real command was given to the overconfident Austrian Chief of Staff, Franz von Weirother. His risky plan called for a massive attack on the French right flank to cut Napoleon's supply lines, assuming the French were weak there. The Allied army counted around 85,000 men with 318 guns, while Napoleon had 72,000 troops and 157 guns. Crucially, Marshal Davout's Third Corps, after a grueling 110-kilometer march, arrived just in time to support the French right. The French army was composed of veterans from prior campaigns in Italy and along the Rhine, giving them a combat edge. Napoleon anticipated the Allied plan. He had deliberately weakened his right to lure the Allies into a trap, leaving the vital Pratzen Heights temporarily exposed. His real forces were hidden in the center, ready to retake the heights and smash the enemy in a decisive counterattack. Napoleon's troops were highly mobile, with well-coordinated infantry-artillery support tactics refined during previous battles. At 8 a.m., the Allies attacked Telnitz, but French resistance and the timely arrival of Davout turned the tide. Davout's troops had marched through the night with little rest, making their timely appearance even more remarkable. Meanwhile, under pressure from Tsar Alexander I, Kutuzov's Fourth Corps abandoned the Pratzen Heights, a fatal mistake. Napoleon seized the moment. "One sharp blow and the war is over," he said, ordering Marshal Soult to storm the heights. Hidden by fog, French troops advanced. At the key moment, the morning mist lifted. The legendary Sun of Austerlitz shone, revealing to stunned Russian soldiers the full force of Napoleon's army ascending the hill. After fierce bayonet fighting, the French captured the heights. The Russian Imperial Guard launched a desperate counterattack, briefly breaking through, even capturing a French standard. This was the only French standard lost during the battle, but Napoleon responded by sending in his own elite cavalry. Reinforcements from Bernadotte's corps soon arrived, helping to rout the Russians. Grand Duke Constantine, commanding the Guard, narrowly escaped death during the charge. In the north, Lannes and Murat's forces defeated Russian cavalry under Bagration. This sector saw heavy cavalry-on-cavalry action, with Murat's cuirassiers playing a decisive role. In the south, Davout and Saint-Hilaire broke through at Sokolnitz and Telnitz. Many Allied leaders fled. The commander of the Allied left, Buxhoden, was reportedly drunk and left the battlefield in chaos. Austrian General Langeron, responsible for a key attack column, also lost control of his men during the retreat. During the retreat, part of the Russian army attempted to flee across the frozen Sachin lakes. French artillery opened fire, breaking the ice. Hundreds of men and cannons sank into the freezing water. A controversial yet confirmed tragedy. The French used their 12-pounder cannons for this bombardment, which had a long range and destructive effect on frozen surfaces. In total, the Allies lost around 36,000 men, 180 guns, and 50 flags, nearly 40% of their army. The French lost about 9,000. It was one of the most lopsided victories in Napoleonic history. Napoleon's victory was celebrated across France. In a letter to Josephine, he wrote, "I have defeated the Austro-Russian army commanded by 2 emperors. I am somewhat tired. I embrace you." The battle led to an armistice with Austria and the Treaty of Pressburg. Austria ceded territory, paid 40 million francs, and transferred Venice to Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy. More importantly, the victory allowed Napoleon to form the Confederation of the Rhine, dissolving the Holy Roman Empire, which had lasted nearly 1,000 years. Emperor Francis II then took the title Francis I, Emperor of Austria, ending his role as Holy Roman Emperor. But peace did not last. In 1706, fearing France's rising power, Prussia declared war. In Napoleon's campaign resumed, the flames of Europe would burn again within months. After his stunning victory at Austerlitz, where he decisively crushed the Third Coalition, Napoleon appeared unstoppable. Europe, dazzled by his military genius, watched as the French emperor rose to unprecedented heights. However, these days of unchallenged power were not to last forever. On the horizon, the Fourth Coalition formed in 1806, led by Prussia, eager to halt France's expanding dominance. Napoleon responded with remarkable speed and precision. His army struck decisively at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14, 1806. At Jena, Napoleon personally orchestrated rapid and coordinated maneuvers, overwhelming the Prussian forces with superior tactics and relentless artillery and cavalry assaults. The Prussian army, hampered by outdated strategies and slow command, suffered a catastrophic defeat, shattering its core military strength. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt showcased Napoleon's mastery of speed and coordination, dismantling one of Europe's oldest armies and opening a new chapter of French dominance. Simultaneously, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout faced a larger Prussian force at Auerstedt. Despite being outnumbered, Davout's corps held firm and delivered a stunning victory through exceptional discipline and tactical brilliance. These twin victories effectively destroyed Prussia's capacity to resist and opened the path for French occupation of key territories, including Berlin. Following these successes, Napoleon pressed into Poland, where Russian forces awaited. The Battle of Eylau in February 1807 was a brutal and indecisive confrontation, fought in fierce winter conditions and a blinding snowstorm. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and the battle ended without a clear victor, highlighting the growing scale and ferocity of the Napoleonic Wars. Yet the harsh winter fight at Eylau foreshadowed that the road ahead would be brutal and uncertain. Napoleon regained the initiative at Friedland in June 1807, where he delivered a crushing blow to the Russian army, forcing Tsar Alexander I to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Tilsit followed, symbolizing a temporary alliance between France and Russia and redrawing Europe's political map. Napoleon placed his relatives on several thrones, with his brother Jerome crowned King of Westphalia, and the Duchy of Warsaw established as a French client state, extending French influence into Eastern Europe. To weaken Britain, his chief rival, Napoleon enforced the continental system, a vast trade embargo aimed at isolating British commerce. While ambitious, the blockade was difficult to enforce, with widespread smuggling and resistance from European allies. The embargo hurt European economies and created unrest, undermining Napoleon's hold. The continental system, while ambitious, inadvertently sowed discord among Napoleon's allies and weakened the very economies he sought to control. When Portugal refused to comply with the continental system, Napoleon launched an invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 1808, igniting the Peninsular War. Despite early victories, French forces encountered fierce guerrilla resistance from Spanish fighters who waged relentless hit-and-run attacks. These irregular tactics, combined with British support under the Duke of Wellington, turned Spain into a draining quagmire that sapped French military and financial resources for years. The brutal nature of the conflict and the harsh French reprisals deepened resentment and fueled nationalist resistance. The Peninsular War proved that even Napoleon's mighty armies could be worn down by determined resistance and unconventional warfare, revealing the fragile nature of his empire's reach. In 1809, Austria seized the opportunity to challenge French dominance, entering the Fifth Coalition. At the Battle of Aspern-Essling near Vienna, Austrian forces dealt Napoleon a rare setback by disrupting his crossing of the Danube River. Though not decisive, this battle exposed vulnerabilities in Napoleon's seemingly invincible army. The battle raged for 2 days, with Napoleon's troops trapped on a small bridgehead as the Danube's unpredictable currents swept away their pontoon bridges. French forces fought desperately to hold their ground, but repeated Austrian counterattacks forced them to withdraw. It was the first clear sign that Napoleon's army was not invulnerable. And the loss of Marshal Lannes, one of his most trusted commanders, struck a heavy emotional blow. Just weeks later, Napoleon returned with a larger, reorganized army to confront the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram. This 2-day clash in early July 1809 involved over 300,000 soldiers, one of the largest engagements of the Napoleonic Wars. The French unleashed massive artillery barrages and coordinated assaults to break the Austrian lines, eventually forcing them to retreat after bloody fighting. Though Napoleon emerged victorious, the cost was staggering, tens of thousands of casualties, and it was clear that his victories were becoming more costly and less decisive than in the past. However, Napoleon soon recovered, winning a costly victory at the Battle of Wagram in July 1809, forcing Austria to accept harsh peace terms. To strengthen political ties, he married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, cementing a fragile alliance. Despite these efforts, tensions with Russia lingered, especially over enforcement of the continental system and conflicting ambitions. Meanwhile, the alliance with Russia was a tenuous one, strained by conflicting ambitions and economic pressures that would soon erupt into open conflict. Between 1809 and 1812, Napoleon's empire seemed to be at its peak, but cracks had already begun to appear beneath the surface. While he celebrated his marriage to Marie-Louise and the birth of an heir in Paris, his armies were stretched thin, bled by constant campaigning and the relentless Peninsular War. The continental system fueled growing discontent across Europe, sparking resistance in the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy as local economies suffered under the trade embargo. France increasingly relied on troops from satellite states to fill the ranks of the Grande Armée, highlighting the strain on French manpower. Meanwhile, relations with Russia cooled rapidly. Tsar Alexander and the Russian nobility resented the economic hardships caused by the blockade and began to openly ignore Napoleon's demands. By 1812, the empire that had once seemed unshakable stood on fragile foundations, and Napoleon's fateful decision to march into Russia would expose its hidden weaknesses to the world. By 1812, Napoleon resolved to punish Russia for its reluctance and the threat it posed. The Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River, marking the beginning of the most ambitious and fateful campaign of his career. Russian commanders Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration chose a strategic withdrawal combined with scorched earth tactics, retreating deeper into Russia while destroying crops and towns to deny resources to the French. The Battle of Smolensk in August 1812 saw fierce fighting, but Russian forces withdrew, leaving the city burning and French troops stretched thin. The logistical nightmare worsened as supply lines lengthened and the approaching threats loomed. The campaign's climax was the Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812, a brutal and massive engagement involving roughly 250,000 soldiers. General Mikhail Kutuzov's Russian army took strong defensive positions across fortified redoubts. The French launched repeated assaults on these earthworks, especially the Great Redoubt, with heavy casualties on both sides. Approximately 30,000 French and 40,000 Russians were killed or wounded. Despite tactical gains and occupation of the battlefield, Napoleon failed to annihilate the Russian army, which retreated in order. The immense scale of bloodshed and the stubborn Russian defense signaled a turning tide. Napoleon had won the field, but not the war. Napoleon's decision to hold back his elite imperial guard for a final decisive blow, never delivered, remains a subject of historical debate. The battle's tremendous human cost and indecisive outcome foreshadowed the brutal challenges ahead. After Borodino, Napoleon advanced to Moscow, expecting a political victory that would force Russia's surrender. Instead, he found the city abandoned and soon engulfed in flames, likely set deliberately by Russian forces or citizens to deny the invaders shelter and supplies. The occupation of a burning, deserted Moscow was a hollow victory. The fiery ruins of Moscow only deepened the crisis, and the catastrophic retreat forever altered the course of European history. Waiting weeks for peace negotiations that never materialized, Napoleon faced a dire situation. With supplies dwindling and winter approaching, he was forced to order a retreat in October 1812. The retreat became a catastrophic ordeal. French soldiers suffered starvation, disease, frostbite, and constant harassment by Russian irregular cavalry, including Cossacks who used guerrilla tactics to deadly effect. The crossing of the Berezina River in November turned into a desperate struggle, as hastily constructed pontoon bridges collapsed under fire and thousands drowned or were killed. Napoleon escaped with only a fraction of his once mighty army, which had been decimated by weather, combat, and exhaustion. This disaster shattered his aura of invincibility and emboldened European powers. Austria and Prussia rejoined the coalition, while Britain ramped up support. Napoleon returned to Paris facing mounting pressure and the unraveling of his empire. The failed Russian campaign marked a turning point, exposing the limits of his power and setting the stage for the coalition victories that would ultimately end his reign. The disastrous Russian campaign marked not just a military defeat, but the beginning of Napoleon's decline. The massive losses shattered the morale of the Grande Armée and exposed the vulnerabilities of his once seemingly invincible empire. As the coalition forces sensed weakness, they renewed their efforts to dismantle French dominance across Europe. Napoleon's ambitions, once unstoppable, now faced the harsh reality of resistance and rebellion on multiple fronts. This turning point foreshadowed the series of battles and political upheavals that would eventually lead to his downfall and exile.
Napoleon, returning from the disastrous Russian campaign, gathers the remnants of his Grande Armée along the western borders of France. His forces are diminished but still disciplined, with veterans who have survived the harsh winter and battles in Russia and Germany. As he reorganizes his troops, he faces the challenge of confronting the coalition armies gathering across Europe. In October 1813, the forces of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden converge near Leipzig, prepared to encircle and destroy Napoleon's army. Napoleon positions his forces strategically around Leipzig, creating three main defensive sectors. On the northeast, he places Marshal Ney with approximately 80 men, tasked with holding the bridges and preventing the coalition from cutting off retreat routes. In the center, Marshal MacDonald commands around 70 troops to hold the line and support both flanks as needed. On the southern flank, Marshal Oudinot and Davout position 60 men to maintain contact with the western approach, guarding routes back toward France. Each corps is subdivided into infantry, cavalry, and artillery units, with batteries positioned to maximize crossfire along key roads and choke points. On October 16, the battle begins with coalition forces attacking the northern and eastern approaches. Prussian and Russian infantry advance in coordinated columns, supported by heavy artillery that opens fire on French positions. Napoleon responds with cavalry charges led by Ney, striking at exposed enemy flanks. These charges momentarily disrupt the coalition columns, forcing them to regroup under fire. Artillery duels erupt across the field, shells cutting paths through the dense formations. By midday, the coalition advances on the southern and western sectors. Austrian infantry marches in dense lines, while Swedish and Saxon units attempt to flank the French right. Davout's forces counterattack, using rapid infantry volleys and cannon fire to stall the enemy. Cavalry skirmishes erupt along open fields as French cuirassiers charge against enemy cavalry attempting to exploit gaps. Napoleon coordinates movements using couriers and signals, shuttling reinforcements from the center to threatened sectors. On October 17, fighting intensifies as Napoleon orders counter-offensives to reclaim lost ground. Ney launches a coordinated assault on the Prussian lines in the north, supported by heavy artillery barrages. Infantry units move in echelon formation, aiming to push back enemy forces while maintaining defensive cohesion. In the south, Davout maneuvers troops to cut off advancing Austrian columns, forcing them into defensive positions behind hedgerows and small villages. Napoleon personally oversees troop movements, riding along key positions to inspire officers and ensure coordination. The battle on October 18 becomes a contest of attrition. Coalition forces attempt to encircle Leipzig completely, coordinating simultaneous assaults on multiple fronts. MacDonald holds the center, repelling repeated attacks while sending cavalry reinforcements to threatened sectors. Ney's troops face relentless pressure but manage to maintain the bridges, buying precious time for retreat options. Artillery exchanges reach devastating intensity, with cannon fire leveling villages and fields, leaving smoke and chaos across the battlefield. By October 19, the French situation deteriorates. Coalition armies achieve partial encirclement, cutting off key supply lines. Napoleon orders a general retreat toward the west, intending to regroup across the Elster River. However, a premature destruction of the bridges leaves approximately 30 French soldiers trapped, captured by advancing coalition forces. Napoleon's retreat is organized under constant harassment, as pursuing enemy cavalry targets stragglers and isolated units. The remnants of the Grande Armée withdraw toward France, facing logistical difficulties, fatigue, and demoralization among troops. Crossing into France, Napoleon begins reorganizing his forces to defend against the advancing coalition. By early 1814, Allied armies press into northeastern France, aiming to capture Paris. Napoleon employs the strategy of interior lines, rapidly shifting troops between threatened sectors to engage isolated enemy columns. Battles at Brienne-la-Ville and La Rothière result in tactical victories for Napoleon, using swift infantry maneuvers and concentrated artillery fire. At Champaubert, Napoleon employs feigned retreats to lure enemy units into traps, striking with concentrated attacks that rout segments of the opposing forces. Despite these successes, the coalition's numerical advantage and persistent pressure create insurmountable challenges. Logistics are strained. French troops face shortages of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. In successive engagements, French forces are gradually worn down. At Montmirail and Vauchamp, Napoleon's maneuvers achieve local tactical superiority, but the overarching strategic situation continues to favor the Allies. In March 1814, coalition armies close on Paris. Napoleon attempts to defend the city, but the disparity in numbers and exhaustion of his forces lead to a French defeat. Allied troops enter Paris, and Napoleon, recognizing the impossibility of further resistance, abdicates on April 6, 1814. He is exiled to the island of Elba, where he is given sovereignty over the small territory, but remains isolated from the European continent. Less than a year later, in February 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba and lands in southern France. His return sparks widespread enthusiasm among the French populace and the army. Soldiers who had previously served under him rejoin voluntarily, swelling his forces to tens of thousands. Recognizing the urgent need to strike before coalition forces consolidate, Napoleon advances northward, aiming to disrupt the Allies' coordination. The campaign begins with the Battle of Ligny on June 16, 1815. Napoleon faces Prussian forces under Blücher. French troops are arranged to exploit terrain features, using a combination of frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers. Infantry columns advance steadily, supported by artillery barrages that target enemy positions. Cavalry units execute charges against exposed Prussian wings, breaking through initial defenses. By the afternoon, French forces achieve a tactical victory, forcing Prussians to retreat toward Wavre. Simultaneously, Wellington's Anglo-Allied army occupies defensive positions near Quatre Bras. Napoleon detaches forces to engage Wellington, but Wellington's disciplined infantry squares and strategic use of terrain resist French assaults. Skirmishes continue until both armies prepare for the decisive confrontation at Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo begins. Napoleon positions his forces centrally, intending to strike the Anglo-Allied army before the Prussian forces can arrive. French infantry advances in multiple columns, with artillery batteries opening fire to soften enemy defenses. Early attacks focus on strategic points, the farm of Hougoumont on the right flank and La Haye-Sainte in the center. Cavalry units repeatedly charged to exploit gaps, but Wellington's troops maintained disciplined formations, repelling assaults with musket and cannon fire. By midday, the French managed to capture portions of La Haye-Sainte, forcing Wellington to commit reserves to stabilize the center. Napoleon orders a series of attacks along the flanks, attempting to encircle the Anglo-Allied forces. Heavy rain has turned the battlefield into mud, slowing French artillery and reducing the effectiveness of cavalry charges. Coordination becomes difficult, with units losing cohesion under fire and adverse conditions. In the late afternoon, Blücher's Prussian forces arrive from the east. They engage the French right flank, forcing Napoleon to divert troops from the main assault. Prussian artillery and infantry pressure increases, threatening the French center and rear. Napoleon commits the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve, in a final attempt to break Wellington's center. Despite fierce fighting, the Guard is repulsed, suffering heavy casualties and losing cohesion. As evening approaches, French forces begin an organized withdrawal under pressure from both Wellington and Blücher. Napoleon's army disintegrates into retreating units, pursued relentlessly by coalition cavalry. By nightfall, French resistance collapses entirely. Napoleon is forced to abdicate once more on June 22, 1815. Following his second abdication, Napoleon is captured and exiled to St. Helena in the South Atlantic. The remote island ensures he cannot return to Europe. His military campaigns end definitively, and he spends the remainder of his life in confinement, reflecting on his rise and fall.